Started. Hello and welcome to the 5th ASABE member hour in our series exploring transforming food and agriculture to circular systems. My name is Jasper Cunningham and I will be representing ASABE as your host. In a few minutes, we will get started, but a little housekeeping. If you would please keep your audio on mute for the entirety of the presentation. If you have questions, please place them in the chat to be discussed during the moderated Q&A segment. And this meeting will be recorded and available for viewing later on. Today, we are lucky enough to have two guests, Keith Klein and Mike Levy. Keith Klein was raised on a family farm in Michigan and earned his BSc from the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources in Ann Arbor and a master's from Farmington State University in International Education. Keith's first career was with USAID and placed him overseas for 24 years in Latin America and Africa while working on sustainable development projects that involved renewable energy systems, protected area planning, and community engagement with forest management and biodiversity conservation. Keith contributes to voluntary international sustainability standards initiatives addressing global barriers to green growth, food security, indirect effects, leakage, monitoring and evaluation. Current projects involve standards for circular economy, ISO TC 323, Food Energy Water Nexus International Research Network, woody biomass for energy, best practices for engaging stakeholder in sustainability assessment, uncertainties and potential bias inherent in choice of a reference or counterfactual scenario, representation of land management and disturbance regimes in modeling, and effective governance approaches to promote more sustainable practices. Mike Levy is a chemical and plastics industry executive and life cycle expert with more than 40 years of diverse experience. He has overseen new recycling and recovery technology for the plastics industry, conducted health, safety, and life cycle assessment studies, coordinated government relations activities, and led stakeholders from government and industry organizations as part of the International Organization for Standardizations, LCA standard development. Notably, he authored the executive guide for LCA titled How to Know When It's Time to Commission a Life Cycle Assessment, which serves as the basis for the American Center for Life Cycle Assessments Certified Life Cycle Executive Certification. Mike spent a significant portion of his career in the chemical and steel industries, supporting long-term strategic goals. His tenure at the American Chemistry Council involved spearheading advocacy efforts for new technologies, life cycle policy activities, and education programs promoting recycling. Mike has also contributed to the development of international standards, including serving on ISO's working groups on environmental management activities, as well as the American National Standard Institute Subcommittee on Life Cycle Assessment. His most recent assignments include supporting corporate initiatives to address life cycle issues and develop circular economy practices. He also provides third-party assessments for organizations to benchmark internal practices with industry best practices and/or standards. Today's presentation is centered on circular economy standards initiatives in the International Organization for Standardization, status, issues, and opportunities. I would like to turn the meeting over to our presenters.
Thanks, Jasper, and welcome. And thanks to ASABE for inviting Keith Klein and me, Mike Levy, for providing this circular economy update on this member hour. I am Mike Levy. I'm a senior associate with First Environment. We're an environmental consulting firm. I'm also one of the co-chairs of this U.S. delegation to TC 323 Circular Economy. And Keith Klein is extremely active in our U.S. tag for two of the key work groups that we'll be talking about today. So between the two of us, we're hoping to give you an overview of circular economy. It's in this role I'm going to cover the following topics today. The scope of the ISO standard and the definition of circular economy, CE, the structure of the various 5 work groups that basically make up these standards, these series of standards, various liaisons to TC 323 technically, some of the challenges and opportunities that Keith and myself in the US are facing as we develop the standards, roll up our sleeves, the work program, the structure of this TC 323, and then kind of the timeline on when you can expect these standards to be developed. We'll talk a little bit about some of the life cycle perspectives and how that fits in the circular economy. And then finally, how you can get involved with our US TAG, our Technical Advisory Group, which is a fancy name for our US delegation of 35 strong and growing. And this little kind of graphic is a tongue-in-cheek a presentation of the complexity of dealing with 80 countries to kind of come up with these standards. This is a popular standard, and we've been at it since 2019. So with that, I'm going to jump right into the presentation. For those of you not familiar with ISO at all, which is the International Organization for Standardization, they define a standard as a document established by consensus and approved by a recognized body that provides basically for common and repeated use, either rules or guidelines or characteristics for a specific activity. Some of you are familiar with the ISO 9000 quality standards, the environmental standards. That today we'll talk about the circular economy standard. There are carbon neutrality standards. There's all kinds of standards that ISO gets involved with. But I think the key here is that these are multinational standards, so they're vetted by countries, and they are really kind of a consensus-based idea. So for those international or multinational companies and organizations and even countries, the idea of a global standard makes a lot of sense because they could use that all over the place. So again, the international standards are used drafting a consensus approach. And that's kind of what makes ISO very different than other national standards. Input is solicited from all of the different stakeholders. And when we say stakeholders, our US TAG is like other countries. We're made up of just individuals like you and me that are experts, not in ISO necessarily, but in your fields. We have government people, Keith and myself from consulting and industry, university folks, consultants, and they make up pretty much the tags across the board. The way ISO works is the national standards body for the country is your representative. So in our country, ANSI, which is the American National Standards Institute, is kind of the official standards group for all these different ISO standards. And then they subcontract it out to different standards groups like ASTM or ASQ, the American Society of Quality. So ANSI is kind of our main thing. Again, these are all voluntary standards, and they're basically developed by volunteers. Whether it's a consultant or someone like myself and Keith and others, we all kind of work together to for the betterment of whatever the standard is. And the key is to harmonize different approaches. A lot of countries already have national standards in a specific area. For instance, on circular economy, the French and the UK, the British and others came to the table with their own ideas. So the key part of an ISO standard is to start with what's out there and then kind of harmonize existing practice and then bring it out. So the key is, again, to identify best practices, and that's what these standards are about. And again, one vote for every member. We are, in this case, one of 80 countries. So it's key to be able to work with like-minded countries if you're trying to get specific positions done. And ISO in a way is like the UN. I mean, it's mostly politics and a lot of science. So why bother with standards? Couple of reasons. Businesses in particular are already setting circularity goals. Many of you know throughout the value chain, you've seen, for instance, waste diversion goals. All packaging will be recycled or composted by 2025. Greenhouse gas net zero goals. So these goals are already being set by businesses and industries, and governments are now kind of taking notice and even beginning to pass regulations with mandates. So there's different interpretations of what constitutes the word circular or circular economy. It's almost kind of like green. there's a lot of people's ideas of what it means. So this particular standard is to basically develop methods to measure, assess, and report circularity performance. That's going to be key to determining if you have a circular economy or circular project or circular solution, that you have something that doesn't provide unintended consequences. And that's where kind of the life cycle part of this comes in. Life cycle's been around, and it's the cradle to grave thinking. It's the whole value chain, and it's a way to look at both environmental and eventually economic and cost aspects of systems. And then finally, as many of the ISO standards, they have verification requirements. If you're an organization or if you're a country and you want to certify that you met the particular standard, kind of like the life cycle standards that have been around, they have a peer review process. This circular economy standard probably down the road will have something like this. So again, in a nutshell, these are the definitions of circular economy. And this is still a work in progress. Keith is very much involved in the working group that's working group 1. And I'll get into the structure in a minute. But the scope of this standard is standardization in the field of circular economy to develop frameworks, guidance, supporting tools, and requirements for the implementation of activities of all organizations. And the key word there is organizations. It's countries, it's regions, it's geographies, and yes, it's businesses and things like that. And again, to maximize the contribution to sustainable development, those 17 UN sustainability goals, Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, are part of this linkage. I mentioned to you this started in May of 2019, so we're about 2.5 years into it, and there's a lot going on here. Now, as far as the definitions of circular economy, right now, these definitions are as of a few months ago, and they kind of evolved. It's an economic system that uses a systematic approach to maintain a circular flow of resources, keywords resources, by regenerating, retaining, or adding to their value while contributing to sustainable development. So again, I'm going to read the bullet points because I think these really show the debate that goes into trying to come up with an actual definition that'll be approved. This is not just an environmental question of circularity, environmental indicators and things like that, or eco-design, but it's also the social aspects, improving the well-being and external interested parties, and the economic aspects, the whole issue of resource use efficiency. So you've got 3 kind of pillars there that have to be all part of these series of standards. Circular economy means to consider a value network, an ecosystem approach of production. And that's kind of where this life cycle perspective comes in, from the raw materials all the way through the end products, et cetera. It's more than just products, though. It also means rethinking relationships. The collaborative mode will support a transition from linear to circularity. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's digitalization, better data management, the whole concept of redesign and shared services versus the current way that we're doing production. And really, it is a mindset. Circular economy, it's kind of a different way of looking at the vision for the economy. It's in essence trying to minimize not only waste, but keep everything in the system. And it does mean a change of behavior. The value chain that's been on board so far with goals, they're in a process of making that kind of conversion. So this is the structure, and I'll just kind of give you the big picture here. In the middle is basically the technical committee, TC 323. There are 5 working groups that are set up to basically develop these series of standards. And each one of these working groups will have its own kind of either standard or technical report. So the first one, working group 1, which Keith is extremely active in, is the nuts and bolts of terminology, principles, frameworks. It defines really what a lot of these definitions that the other groups are going to use. Working group 2 is various case studies and approaches for using circular economy. Working group 3 is another huge one. That's where the rubber meets the road, measuring, assessing circularity using complementary methods and a whole series of toolboxes. Working group 4 are going to be like technical reports, circular economy in practice. It'll be case studies. And working group 5 is a new one I'll talk about a little bit later, called product circularity data sheet. It's kind of like the MSDS approach for those of you in industry, material safety database, kind of looking at like a list of products or attributes. So all those have to come together. And then there's also a joint working group between the life cycle group and this circularity on what began as secondary metals and is now secondary materials. And then finally, there's a chairman's advisory group. I won't dwell on that, but they're kind of the heads of each one of these working groups are different countries, conveners they're called. So they all kind of meet together with this chairman's advisory group as these standards are being developed, and kind of like an advisory board. And I am frozen. Let's see if I can move forward. There we go. This map shows basically the challenges of working with 85 countries. There's 71 participating members. These are members that have votes. And then there's 14 observing members. But the challenges, I think, are, if you can imagine 200, 300, 400 people on a call, these various work groups have different task groups. And so each one of these work groups has been working over the last couple of years in drafting what we call working draft documents that'll eventually go through the system to become a standard. But I think one of the challenges, of course, is to be able to have input. The US delegation has about 35 people, and we do have experts that are on each one of those 5 working groups that I talked about. So we're trying our best to have input. Another thing ISO does is they don't do this in isolation. Whenever you develop a new ISO standard, they have what they call liaisons, both groups, and liaison committees. So the liaison groups are basically other organizations that have an interest in this standard, that may already have some standards, but are not directly participating. So you can see some of the associations. Some of these are very big groups like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. They have in their own organizations, developed some similar materials. So those groups are basically participants. They don't have a vote, but they do have, they can not only participate, but have information that can be brought to the table. And on the right-hand side, there are already existing ISO standards that kind of touch parts of circular economy. So the goal here, for instance, is not to reinvent the wheel. Right in the middle there is TC 207 SC5. That's the life cycle assessment. Those standards have been developed and are probably going to be modified, but so those will be referred to in various annexes and things like that. So there's an effort here to either use definitions from existing ISO standards or just make sure that we're not inadvertently stepping on anybody else's toes here. So let me talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that we have in developing this standard, not only from day one, but where we are right now. So we're clearly trying to come up with environmental and social kind of answers, guides, with an economic alternative to circularity. So this is this whole mindset that promotes circular economy. Waste is considered, we have to rethink waste as a resource. We have to integrate a lot of different concepts in the process. There's the whole value chain situation. This is not just done at a country or facility level, but this is the key. The third one is to provide operational standards for users that are going to use this kind of standard. And the users are going to be, as I mentioned before, yes, there'll be organizations and companies, but there are a lot of countries right now that are looking, just like with climate change policy, they're looking to develop circular economy policy, and especially the developing countries. For them to start from scratch on a circular economy standard would be really tough. So the outcome of this standard probably will feed right into some of the other organizations. This is European dominated with the countries, as many of the ISO standards are. And already in Europe, as you know, the EU and the EC are very much engaged with their own regulations. So they are not only participating in the circular economy, but they have views of using this either in regulations or legislation. In several of the countries that we're working with also are going to be using this for policy. So I want to talk a little bit about the actual work program. And actually, this is kind of the deliverables. So I told you about these work groups, but the output of each one of these work groups is going to either be an individual standard, because TC 323 will be a series of standards, or a technical report, which is a little bit different. So working group 1, which is the terminology principles framework, that'll have its own standard. It'll be called 59004 in ISO terms. So when you go at the end of the day, you'll be able to go through the ISO series of all the standards and be able to say, okay, this is the ISO standard on terminology and principles. The second two there, 59010, is this working group 2, guidance on business models. That'll perform guidelines on how to transform business models from linear to circularity. There'll be probably case studies in there from different countries. Number 3 to the right, 59020, is this metrics standard. Very big standard. That'll have its own standard too. That'll provide a framework to measure and assess circularity performance. It'll have taxonomy. It'll have probably some life cycle references, material flow, all kinds of things in there, indicators. The fourth one, or the one right below in the middle, is 59040. And that's going to be, that's actually working group 5. That's that new one I talked about, product circularity data sheet. It actually just started, it started as a work item, and this April, it's now a full working group. That'll have its own standard. It'll have a kind of a toolbox of how to assess performances at product level. It may get involved in labeling. It may get involved in other types of things. And then that working group 4 I talked about is these supporting documents to provide feedback to make it tangible and concrete. That'll also be case studies. Those will be technical reports, and they go through a slightly different process. Instead of becoming a working draft and a committee draft and a draft international standard, these will become a working draft and then a technical report. So they'll get voted on still through a vetting process, but a little bit sooner. So one will be on 031, 59031 will be a technical report on performance-based approaches, and the other will be on business models. And then those little flags are the countries that are conveners that give you an idea. So like on 59020, that's the Netherlands is actually very much involved. And then I mentioned that joint working group project. They'll also have standards that'll be developed. So what are we talking about here for like a timeline? So as I say, we started this in May of 2019. This process is evolving. In many cases, we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of comments on various working drafts. We're at the stage now that we're trying to go to committee drafts early in February. But the bottom line here is, if somebody said to me, well, when are these standards going to be done? These are optimistic targets. And I say that because they'll probably be later. But the goal right now for the working group 1, 59004, is like in mid 2023. So we're talking about, like a year and a half, something like that, if I did the math right, when that might be coming out. The same with the next couple of standards, number 2 and then number 3, the metrics. I mentioned to you that those 2 technical reports will probably be done earlier. So those will be done either earlier, mid to 2022, and then this working draft. So I think probably realistically, I would say toward the mid to end of 2023 is when you'll see these standards published. And my experience is from other standards, it'll then take a while for people to get used to dealing with the standard, probably another 6 months to a year to either measure against it or things like that. Very quickly, I mentioned that working group 5, and I'll mention this PCDS product declaration, excuse me, the, this particular product circularity data sheet. This is an interesting concept. Some people wanted more of a value-based approach than a life cycle approach. So some wanted to be able to say, well, value-based approaches could be lots of things for circularity. Maybe we restrict certain products. Maybe you have a ban on single-use plastics, for instance, even though, the life cycle may tell you something differently. And then others said, well, maybe we'll have like a list of various products. So that was a concept for a new work item that ended up being its own working group. So I think one of the challenges for these standards is to see what this particular standard is going to end up as, but more importantly, to make sure that, for instance, in the metric standard, that full scientific tool principles that have been out there that are part of the toolbox to assess circularity. Now, I want to talk a little bit about life cycle perspectives and circular economy. When this standard was coming to an idea, ISO TC 207 is where the life cycle standards were developed and actually published back in 2006. They've been amended. That's where the circular economy standard was going to kind of be set up. But eventually the French decided they wanted, the AFNOR French group wanted to really have its own separate standard for not just environmental, but economics. So we know that life cycle provides insights to assess sustainability impacts of circular solutions. Just like any kind of solutions, what LCA tends to do is measure the trade-offs and the opportunities improvements, and then shows you if you're going to do something in the air or climate area or the stormwater area, what impacts it might have on energy. So clearly, whatever the circular economy standards or projects or solutions are, you want some kind of assessment there. So the current thinking is by combining a life cycle approach for the environmental aspects and indicators, along with social LCA, which by the way has its own new ISO standard being developed as we speak, and life cycle costing, which has been out there, economic impact, other types of models like material flow, and then just in general, social models and economic standards. This probably will kind of give you an overall assessment of circularity. It's really the economic and social part of this that it's more difficult to put together because they're not as well developed as the environmental. So both circular solutions and life cycle do require a systematic approach, a value chain approach, and that's kind of common to this circular economy. So again, both require setting up boundaries and defined goals. So our thinking right now is, as we develop especially in the metrics area, we'll have a life cycle in there. Another thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is, I mentioned this life cycle assessment standard was developed back in 2006. ISO for all standards has something called a systematic review. Every 5 years, ISO standards kind of come up for either a confirmation or reopening them. It's a way of course, keeping the standards up to date. So the LCA standards came up in 2010, 2015, and at the time they made some minor changes, but decided not to open them all up. But there's a sense now, because of all the things out there, like these new standards like circular economy, carbon neutrality, net zero, different ways of doing LCAs, environmental product declarations. There's probably a sense that that the standard may come up for a revision. So there's an official ballot vote in December, and there's about 60 countries right now that participate in the LCA work group. So in the US, our chair is Carrie Pearson from 3M, and she heads up a group just like we have in circular economy. And we're setting up a couple of meetings. Actually, they're later this week to get the US consensus position. Right now, the feeling is probably we're going to vote to revise or amend the standard. Now, if that happens, that will basically open up this life cycle standard, much like almost starting from scratch. There's quite a few different issues up, and I'm not putting them on here, but if anybody's interested, definitely let me know. So finally, I want to talk a little bit before we conclude here on what are some of the policy implications of these standards. in particular the life cycle, circular economy standard. So again, standards are historically driven by market demands. We mentioned the ISO 9000 quality standards that were developed way back when. And now we're seeing both not only market demands, but policies, legislation, regulation. Some would argue the circular economy standards kind of came around from the pollution, from plastics in the ocean, from demands to kind of look at making products a different way, low recycling rates for a lot of commodities. And we know that the markets for recycling vary on a lot of different things, but as recycling solutions were put out there and goals weren't met, there was a sense that we needed to kind of have this different way of looking at making products. And that's where really circularity was kind of born a few years ago as a talking point. And now here we are writing a standard. So existing standards written into regulations in US, Canada, and the EU. I already mentioned some of the EU, for instance, has some regulations, BSI in Britain, other places. So the concept here is that once this circular economy standard is published, there's a good chance it may find its way either into definitions and regulations for policy, certainly in legislation. We're already seeing in the US some proposals for recycle mandates and take back legislation and ideas of going into circular economy. So again, a globally accepted definition of circular economy and standards to measure performance probably will likely lead to further policy revisions. I mentioned in our workings within the different ISO countries and working groups, many of those country participants already are going to be integrating this into their policies there in the US and overseas, maybe more so than we would here in the US, where we look at standards as kind of voluntary, but still. Product design for the future, definitely. I mean, we already mentioned about setting goals. We mentioned about a whole new way of making certain products, maybe shared services on different products. It's certainly going to impact advanced and chemical recycling solutions. So all of that's on the table. And then I mentioned these complementary methods, which are kind of an important part of the metric standard. This is really a list of not only ISO standards like life cycle and things, but social standards, already different countries like the UN and others that have standards, organizations like WBSCD that we talked about earlier, companies that already have standards. There's going to be a whole list of a different menu of standard approaches that are going to be relevant for either companies, industries, or regions to use. So again, if any of you are interested in learning more about this or even participating in the group that Keith and I are involved with actually in the standards development, Michelle Wallace from Cotton Incorporated and myself are kind of the co-chairs. And all we do is coordinate about 35 experts, including Keith and many others. And we try to make sure that the US has an impact on developing these standards. And it's a nominal, I'm not soliciting money, but it doesn't cost much. I mentioned the ASTM sometimes is the administrator. In this case, they are. Christy Straighton is the manager. Myself or Keith or Michelle or Christy be happy to talk to you about that. And then finally, I want to acknowledge that this presentation was supported by US DOE, the BETO office. Keith and Maggie Davis has acknowledged their thanks to a whole host of people at the Oak Ridge National Labs that they work with. I want to personally thank Keith because he has been extremely active in the standards activity on behalf of not only US, but international. And again, if you have any specific questions for me at this presentation, here's my contact information as well. And that kind of ends the formal part of the presentation. So I'll be happy to entertain any questions.
Yeah, we have a couple of good questions already, Mike. And let's see, I was trying to just share one other point. I think we mentioned in the title some of the challenges. Just my perspective, we have three big challenges in this ISO committee. One is some people would say we started a little prematurely because typically you do an international standard when national standards come into conflict. When you have established national standards and your threads don't fit the bolts in another country, then you try to get standards to be aligned so that you can trade between countries and everyone can use the same nuts and bolts and they will work. So starting this before we have standards for circular economy that are demonstrated to serve a purpose in individual countries and that then run into problems due to trade is a big challenge. We also started with a very broad scope, and I think that the lack of full agreement on what we're really trying to do and have that be focused has shown to be a problem as we've proceeded. And the third and probably biggest problem we've had and challenge for this group is that we have about 5 work groups developing standards and technical products documents simultaneously, and they're doing it before we even have basic definitions agreed to and established for what is a circular economy. That's still a draft definition. What are the principles for circular economy? There's actually a lot of debate within our group still about that. And yet here we are drafting how we're going to measure and assess performance, trying to guess at what the results are going to be from this process. So these are some real challenges we're facing. I just wanted to throw that in there. The first question, Mike, I'm just reading them in order here, is given this circular economy topic, its standards and importance, is it being considered at the COP26 agenda? And I think almost everything at COP26 is relevant to this, because what this is about is minimizing all emissions and reusing. The theoretical goal is zero net emissions, zero net use of resources, continual reuse and repurposing of resources with renewable inputs. So I would say that this concept of a circular economy is fundamental for all the discussions at COP. But Mike, you might have another answer to that.
No, and I think that's probably true. And one of the things you always hear about on the COP meetings is that the disappointment in not having the political measurements and mandates to follow through with those things. So to some degree, the metrics part of something like circularity can be applied to climate change and things like that. So yeah, I kind of agree with what you're saying. I mean, clearly the focus has been on greenhouse gas, methane, 1.5 degrees and things like that. But many of the solutions, I think, to getting to the climate reductions will be like this whole concept of circular economy.
Yeah, the next question, Mike, is, and I should have probably recognized people. Thank you for these questions. The first question was from Andre Sanchez, and this next question is from Laura Moody. So what considerations are being discussed relative to assessing circularity of bio-based products, given that the accounting for material flow becomes more challenging when the material starts changing form? And that's a really good question. In fact, one of the reasons I'm involved in this committee is due to my interest and concerns that bio-based products be accounted for properly, and that we think about not just renewable in that it is bio-based, but renewable in that the landscape from which any bio-based material is sourced is maintained and regenerated and improved if possible to continue providing all the services that landscape has provided and that society needs that landscape to provide going forward. So the basic principle of meeting today's needs while conserving resources for future generations is that we have to maintain the productivity of the biological systems or improve them if possible as we manage them. And I think your question alludes to this, the bio-based material, biomass basically is going to be the foundation for circularity in the long run, because it's the renewable source for materials, for chemicals, for a lot of products. And we could certainly manage landscapes better. Mike, again, if you want to add something there.
No, I think you answered it pretty good. I will note that even though I didn't talk about it directly here, there is another new standard being developed simultaneously under this TC207 greenhouse gas family called carbon neutrality. And their bio-based materials, of course, again, are front and center. And the same comments Keith made about circular economy also is for the carbon neutrality. I mean, there's tons of things going on there, but I think the tenets are you know, whether it's net zero or carbon zero, but zeroing in on the bio-base and resources, that's part of circular economy, as Keith mentioned. This is not just you know, the environmental kind of a typical manufacturing facility life cycle. It is definitely going to look at natural resources and you know, looking at biomaterials. One of the things that ISO standards are kind of limited to is that they're usually not product specific, so that in some cases, you know, we're talking about dealing with you know, tools and principles and definitions and measurements, as Steve alluded to. And people might say, well, how are you going to deal with a specific product? In this case, the product, you know, PDSC, the product circularity thing may attempt to do that. So I agree with Keith. This will be brought up certainly in some of the series of standards.
Yeah, and I've also been involved, Mike. I don't know if you're aware, with both the people in Australia and the US on that. The term carbon neutrality came up well over a decade ago with biomass, and I've been fighting against it. I think we should account for everything in and out of a system and look at the whole system and not try to use terms that, I think carbon neutrality is one of those terms that gets misinterpreted all the time, like sustainability. So let's see, the next comment I think is simply a thank you. So thank you, B. Tolner. And then the next one is a good question. I think there might have been a misunderstanding. 71 participating countries. I think we actually might have a few more now. And then an additional 8 or 9 observers to make 85 total is what I think we have, Mike. The question is asking about the observers. So observers are other interested parties. Some of them are I'm thinking of, there's observer countries, but then there's other observer parties, right? Mike, maybe you should answer this.
Okay, well, participating in, to participate in these standards, you're either a P member participating or an O member observer. In fact, the United States back in May didn't really have our act together. So we were an observer member during the kickoff May 2019 first meeting in France of over 70 countries. But bottom line is countries like Australia, Austria, Cyprus, Israel, New Zealand, Poland, Slovakia, Togo have elected to be observing members at this point. So that they don't have a vote. That doesn't mean they don't have a seat at the table, but you know, they just don't, you know, they don't meet the requirements through their national standard bodies or elected not to do that. But this, but when I talked about the 80 countries or 85 really now, those are actual countries, meaning standards votes. In other words, you know, we're not talking about organizations within the country. So like with our US, as Keith mentioned, I mean, we have one vote as a country, but we have, like I said, 35 or 40 different people on there. To give you an idea of how that fluctuates, back in the late 90s, when the ISO standards for life cycle were being developed, the US had 450 experts. And that was being driven by the Canadians and the Germans. And even though the interest for circular economy is there, you know, it's hard to get enough people at the table. So, but the difference between, again, of a P member and an O member is if you really want to have a vote on where these standards are going and how they'll be shaped, you need to be a participating member. And right now there are, what, 71. So that's a significant number.
Yeah, I'll just add that my understanding is the reason the US was an observer to start out with, and other countries are also observers still, is that their standard bodies opposed trying to develop a standard for circular economy internationally.
Yeah.
At this point, because it is premature and we don't have a good set of standards in any countries to point out to say, here's standards that work, but they are incompatible here. So let's have an international grouping to get together and align and harmonize these standards. That's what the international system is supposed to do. But instead, people are trying to jump out in front and create this framework. And all these international standards are voluntary standards. So just because we're a member or not a member has really no bearing on any requirement to follow the standard. These are voluntary standards. People tend to use them to be able to say, well, I followed ISO standard 1044 or whatever the number is, when I did this, saying that they have followed a defined set of rules and procedures to produce something or to document how they produce something. So, but it is voluntary.
Yeah, and to that point, one of the reasons that the United States obviously became a participating member is we know that a standard like this is going to proceed without us in this case. And even though you're right, Keith, about whether it's ASTM E60 having their own standard first or things like that, in many cases we've seen these standards become kind of pseudo regulations, and they become kind of almost mandated at some point, because they're adopted, they're used, and
yeah,
which,
they could be adopted through regulation or law in a given country later. That's right. So I think, Mike, here's a good question for you, given your presentation. Kashlendra Tingi, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name, asks how performance indicators of circularity can be adopted from one operation to another throughout a supply chain. The cost of an ingredient becomes an input, calculating production cost of a product it's made from. He says that it says LCA does not help much here. So we have different system boundaries that we're trying to, different levels that are being defined in these standards for how someone might measure circularity. And one of them that we're really aiming at is an interorganizational level that's designed to build synergies and track things through multiple business operations, multiple organizations as defined in the standard, so that you can capture a whole system and include all the different entities in one analysis. But it's complicated, and Mike, I'll let you. You're the LCA.
Yeah, and that is a very good question, and that's one of the reasons that we don't want to oversay that a life cycle full assessment is done in every single one of these aspects. That's not the point. I mean, the life cycle perspective includes the value chain, but in developing the environmental indicators, clearly they're going to be looking at how we're assessing, different, either whether it's a product or an organization, whether it's through a management system, using what we have already on the table. And as I mentioned, like material flow analysis or some of these other risk assessment modes, if that's a better indicator than a full life cycle, clearly we want to be able to provide any organizations that's measuring against the standard an opportunity to have different tools in their toolbox. I suspect at the end of the day, this standard will, in fact, be one that'll have some kind of verification scheme, so that much like whether there's avoided emission standards or things like that out there, or even recycled content mandates or things that need to be verified. If this standard has a series of indicator calculations that you're going to follow, there might be a third party kind of almost like a full life cycle assessment report review, but not doing a full life cycle assessment. So right now, the indicators are part of this whole metrics operation, and will be referenced in the that particular 59020 standard, and hopefully there'll be enough options there for companies that want to use that part of the standard and not be held to a full life cycle assessment.
Hey, Mike, could you please back up one slide in the slide deck? Because the next question points out that, yeah, there's a lot of voluntary standards, and including industry voluntary standards and certification organizations. Since these ISO standards are still about 2 years out, how can these groups stay informed of and or become involved in the work in progress by the ISO working groups? And that you were on it. The slide, I just wanted to show the slide with your contact and Michelle's contact again.
Oh yeah, sure.
And maybe I was trying to think off the top of my head all the industries we already have involved, but we have a lot of U.S. industries represented on the U.S. Technical Advisory Group, as we call it, and anyone on this call, everyone's eligible to join basically, and often people join through their their industry association, which often has an expert on standards, but it's really open to anyone. And Mike, I'll let you take that one from there.
Yeah, and actually that's a good segue into my experience with the ISO standards, both in the trade association world and now in the consulting world. ISO standards do tend to be dominated by either consultants or trade groups, simply because in many cases, even though industries in general are very interested in this, they don't all have the bandwidth to participate in multiple long-term standards development. And one of the reasons that industries tend to join specific trade associations is to have the association get involved. So that's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, we have a lot of great trade associations that are part of this in any of the different country groups. But on the other hand, if you are an industry that has a specific sector that you think needs to be up to date, the best way to do it is to literally join our group. And the reason being is that ISO has very strict policies on who gets to see the documents. All of these working drafts, they are not for distribution outside of the TAG members. We have our own collaboration site, as does other countries. And clearly the members of the TAG need to have that information as we develop that. But so even if you just want a seat at the table to see what's coming down the pike, or more importantly, we've had a couple of companies that have just joined because they wanted to, for instance, have maybe their sector represented in one of the case studies. So again, that's a good example on why you might want to join. So as I said before, it's I'll just right off the top of my head. ASTM charges $500 for an organization. And we came up with that number because ANSI has to pay a fee to participate in the ISO for circular economy. And we estimated like 20 people and passed the hat around. So it's not really, really expensive. So if you're an individual, if you're a company member, if you're from a agency or anything like that, if you want to be a part of the delegation, it's a $500 kind of one-time commitment. And again, I'd be happy to talk to anybody here that's interested. We are constantly getting people that are joining. The group is growing, but I would say this is going to impact industry quite a bit. So it would be nice to add to our very good, solid group of government, consulting, and university folks, more industry folks as well.
And Mike, just to add to that, even without joining, if you have an industry representative or sector representative that you are related to, you can stay up to date. You can get the information and be informed what's going on without necessarily becoming a formal member. You just need to get on a email list.
Yeah, and we try to those of us that are in the TAG, develop these kinds of presentations that at least give you kind of the big picture overview, so that you can either go the next step or find out, for instance, maybe you have somebody in your own organization that's involved in another ISO standard activity. But I would say this particular standard, the carbon neutrality standard, there's quite a few of them that are going to be front and center in this whole area of sustainability and sustainable development. And like I said, I mean, Keith and I are involved in the day-to-day things, and it's difficult even for us to keep up with everything. So
I've been in most of the calls on the definitions and principles, and there's still a lot of disagreement. And another link to COP26, I don't think I've ever been in a full 2-hour session where at least one person didn't bring up the issue of greenwashing. Greenwashing is a big concern for many of the people that are participating in these work groups, and we hear about it all the time, and we're trying to figure out how do we develop a standard that would provide confidence, that would build trust in that what people report is what is really happening. And that also is a challenge, and that's one of the things that's been raised especially by the demonstrators at COP26, according to the news reports I've been hearing. So I just thought I'd throw that in. We are discussing that explicitly as we develop this standard.
Yeah, and I'm sympathetic to a lot of companies that want to be carbon neutral or net zero, and frankly don't have a uniform position, uniform definition, uniform anything. And that's one of the reasons the carbon neutrality ISO 14068 standard that's literally just started under ISO 207. That goal of that standard is to kind of come up with some of those definitions and claims and things like that. And that too will be a very contentious and detailed standard to develop. But if you step back and say, yeah, I mean, it would be good to finally have maybe a global standard that defines some of those things. But in the interim, you're going to have a lot of different people out there that offer different, different ways to either measure or come up with that. And it's up to you as an individual organization to determine if it's a legitimate non-greenwash standard based on scientific principles and things like that.
I think we're right on time, so I'm gonna, I think we've answered every question. If I missed one, let me know, but I think we've addressed them. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks again, too, and thanks, Keith. And clearly, anybody that needs to follow up with any of us, you have our contact information.
Yeah, thank you.
Well,
oh yeah, go ahead.
I would like to thank everyone for their participation today, and a special thank you to our guests, Mike Levy and Keith Klein. And I would also like to extend a thank you to Chuck Roth for spearheading our Member Hour series. And a special thank you to everyone else who has helped out to make the Member Hour a reality. As previously mentioned, this was the 5th part of a traditional 5-part series on circular systems. However, due to popular demand, we are going to be adding 2 more segments on transforming food and agriculture to circular systems. The next one will be Thursday, December 2nd, and that is going to take a look at farm scale circular systems.